All right, let's dive right into a cybersecurity vulnerability that's making some waves. It's called CVE 2024 ADAX9.
Yeah, this one's got everyone talking.
And we've got some great research from SonicWall Capture Labs threat research team to help us break it down.
Really interesting stuff.
Basically, we're going to unpack how this vulnerability could give hackers a way to turn a common business tool into, well, a weapon.
Yeah, that's the scary part. And what makes it even more interesting is that it targets something a lot of businesses rely on.
Uh-oh, this sounds serious. What is it?
Citrix virtual apps and desktops.
Ah, so those virtual workspaces everyone's been using for remote work.
Exactly. Think about how many companies depend on those tools these days. It's a big deal.
Definitely not some obscure piece of code then.
Nope. This is
hmm
something that could have a real impact on how people work. And get this, the vulnerability hinges on a feature most people probably use every day without even thinking about it.
Let me guess. Is it screen sharing?
Close. It's session recording.
Session recording. Okay, I can see how that could be a target.
Think about it. Session recording allows IT to capture all sorts of stuff. Keystrokes, screen activity, maybe even recordings.
Yeah, for training, troubleshooting, compliance.
You name it.
So it sounds like this seemingly harmless feature can actually open a back door for attackers.
That's right. And the report uses this phrase, insecure deserialization.
Insecure deserialization. That sounds a little intimidating. Can you break that down for us? What does that actually mean?
Sure, think of it like this. Imagine you're packing a suitcase for a trip. Serialization is like neatly packing all your stuff, organizing it so it all fits.
Gotcha. So deserialization would be like unpacking at your destination, putting everything back in its place.
Exactly. But now imagine that someone tampers with your suitcase while you're traveling. They could swap out something harmless for something dangerous.
Ooh, okay, now it's getting interesting. So are you saying insecure deserialization lets hackers basically mess with data while it's being unpacked, potentially sneaking in some malicious code?
Precisely. They're exploiting the unpacking process.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. But how does this suitcase analogy actually play out with Citrix session recording? I'm not quite seeing the connection yet.
So there's this thing called the Citrix Session Recording Storage Manager. It's also known as SSREC Storage Manager.exe. This thing, it uses serialization to deal with all those recorded session files it gets from people's computers.
From users' computers, right?
Yeah, so the vulnerability is all about how that service unpacks those files.
Because it's doing it insecurely.
Right, that's the gap attackers are going for.
Now, the report also mentioned something called Microsoft Message Queuing, or MSMQ. What does it have to do with all of this?
Okay, so MSMQ is basically like a messaging service for applications. Think of it as a way for different programs to talk to each other.
Even if they're on different networks.
Yeah, even if one of them is offline temporarily.
So, like a high-tech postal system for software.
Exactly. And it comes into play here because the session recording service uses MSMQ to get those recorded session files.
Oh, I see. So data's moving around using MSMQ, and it needs to be packed and unpacked using serialization, and that's where the weakness is.
You got it. It's the combination of Citrix session recording, MSMQ, and this insecure deserialization that creates the security loophole.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got data moving around, it's being packed and unpacked, and there's a security gap. But can we dig a little deeper into the technical details here? What makes this deserialization process in Citrix so insecure?
All right. Imagine you leave your house keys under the welcome mat. That's essentially what the vulnerable code is doing. It sets permissions that are way too open. Anyone could get in.
Yikes, so an attacker could just waltz right in.
That's the danger. And to make matters worse, there's this method called OpenQ that uses a really risky class for deserialization called binary message formatter.
Binary message formatter.
Doesn't sound good.
It's not. Even Microsoft says you shouldn't use it because it's vulnerable to this kind of attack.
It's like choosing a lock that everyone knows how to pick. Exactly. And on top of that, if you enable MSMQ over HTTP, which is usually on by default, it makes things even riskier for remote attacks.
So we've got overly permissive settings, a risky way of unpacking data, and it's all happening over a protocol that's open to remote access. This really does sound like a hacker's dream come true.
It kind of is, yeah. And what's worse is that the report indicates attackers are very much aware of this vulnerability.
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand the technical side of things a bit better. But let's talk about what this actually looks like in practice. How would a hacker actually exploit this vulnerability?
Well, they'd need a few things. First, they'd need network access to the target system.
Like an open door to the building, so to speak.
Right. Second, the session recording service actually needs to be running on that system.
So it's not a guaranteed entry point for every Citrix setup.
Exactly. And finally, they need to be able to send a specially crafted message to the MSMQ endpoint over HTTP.
So they're basically sending a message, but it's booby-trapped.
Precisely. It looks innocent on the outside, but it contains malicious code just waiting to be unpacked through that insecure deserialization process.
That's sneaky. And the Sonic Wall report actually analyzes an example of one of these malicious requests, right? Can you break that down for us?
Sure. It's got three main parts. There's a SOAP-action header, which basically tells the server what the message is supposed to do. Then there's the SOAP envelope.
Okay, and what's the third part?
Ah, that's the dangerous one, the serialized payload. That's the stuff that's carefully crafted to trigger code execution on the server.
Wow, so a hacker could potentially take over an entire server just by sending a cleverly disguised message.
That's the potential impact, and it's a big reason why this vulnerability is causing so much concern.
That makes sense. Now, let's talk about the fallout for a moment.
Yeah.
What happens if a hacker actually manages to pull this off? What are the real-world consequences we're talking about here?
Well, let's just say it's not good. Remote code execution basically gives the attacker control over the server.
So they could do pretty much anything they want.
Pretty much. Steal data, install malware, even take control of other systems on the network.
And the report makes it clear that this isn't just a theoretical threat, right? This is actually happening.
Oh, absolutely. One of the most alarming things in the report is this threat graph from SonicWall's own sensor data. It shows a huge spike in attempts to exploit this vulnerability.
So hackers are actively trying to take advantage of this right now.
Yep, it's definitely something businesses need to take seriously.
No doubt about it. Now, there's a little bit of debate about whether an attacker needs prior access to exploit this vulnerability, right? Whether it requires authentication or not.
That's right. Some say you need a key to get in, others say the door's wide open.
So should we be more worried if it turns out to be unauthenticated?
Well, regardless of who's right about that, the potential damage is serious enough that everyone should be taking action.
Better safe than sorry, especially when we're talking about remote code execution.
Exactly. We can't afford to wait around and see what happens.
So patching those Citrix instances, getting those Sonic Wall protections in place, and just generally beefing up security are all critical steps.
Absolutely. And this whole thing really highlights how even seemingly harmless features can hide some pretty dangerous vulnerabilities.
You're telling me it's been a really eye-opening deep dive so far. Before we move on, are there any key takeaways you want to emphasize for our listeners?
I think the big takeaway is that security is a constant game of cat and mouse. Attackers are always looking for new ways in, so we have to be just as persistent in defending our systems.
And it's not just up to the IT folks or the cybersecurity experts. We all have a role to play in keeping our digital lives secure.
Absolutely. Everyone needs to be aware and take action.
So we've covered the vulnerability, the potential impact, and what people can do to protect themselves. But this whole discussion has gotten me thinking about the bigger picture.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, this Citrix situation really highlights the constant back and forth between security researchers and attackers. How can we, as individuals and organizations, stay ahead of the curve when the threats are constantly changing?
That's a great question. And it's not an easy one to answer. But I think staying informed, being part of the security community, and always learning and adapting are all key parts of the solution.
Sounds like good advice. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about that in the next part of our deep dive.
This whole thing with Citrix session recording, it really shows you how, even a small feature can have huge security implications.
It's like that saying the devil is in the details.
Right.
And in this case, the details are about unpacking these virtual suitcases filled with malicious code.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that security has to be a holistic approach. You can't just focus on the big, obvious stuff. You got to consider everything, every component, every feature, even every single line of code.
Yeah, it's like building a house. You wouldn't just worry about the walls and the roof. You'd make sure the foundation was solid too. And in software, that foundation includes secure coding practices, making sure data is handled properly.
Absolutely. And that's where defense in depth comes in. It's about having layers of security, so even if one layer fails, there are others to back it up.
So it's not just about patching this one vulnerability, it's about making the whole system more resilient, right?
Right. And that means regular security audits, penetration testing, even training employees. Because even the most secure system can be vulnerable if someone clicks on a phishing link or uses a weak password.
Yeah, human error is still a big factor in a lot of cyber attacks, which reminds me, the report mentions this disagreement between the vendor and security researchers about whether this vulnerability needs authentication.
Ah, yes, the debate about whether an attacker needs prior access to exploit it, it's a crucial point.
It is, because if it really is unauthenticated, that means anyone with network access could potentially attack, like leaving your front door wide open.
Exactly. It would make the attack surface so much bigger, increase the risk dramatically. Imagine the damage someone could do if they could just walk into any system, no key needed.
But if authentication is required,
Mm.
that suggests a more targeted attack, right? Where
Mm.
the attacker already has some kind of access. Maybe they phished credentials or something.
Right. It could change the motives and maybe even limit the impact.
So how do we make sense of this disagreement? What should businesses be thinking about? Should they be more worried if it turns out to be unauthenticated?
Well, honestly, regardless of who's right about the authentication, the potential consequences are serious enough that we need to address it. We can't wait to see who's right.
Better to be safe than sorry, especially when we're talking about the possibility of remote code execution.
Exactly. And that's where the erring on the side of caution principle comes in. Even if there's some uncertainty about the vulnerability, it's always better to take proactive steps to mitigate the risk. It's like wearing a seatbelt. Even if you don't plan on getting in an accident, it's good to be prepared.
So patching those Citrix instances, implementing those sonic wall protections, and strengthening overall security, those are still the most important things to do.
Absolutely. And I think this really highlights a larger trend in cybersecurity. Collaboration and sharing information is becoming more and more important. We can't expect one company or organization to find and fix every single vulnerability.
Yeah, no one has all the answers when it comes to cybersecurity.
Exactly. We need to share knowledge, best practices, even threat intelligence. And that includes vendors, security researchers, even competitors working together. It's like a neighborhood watch for the digital world. We all have to pitch in to keep our communities safe.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And reports like this one from SonicWall, they play a crucial role in that effort.
Yeah.
They highlight these emerging threats, they provide technical details, and they even offer some practical advice.
Yeah, they give individuals and organizations the power to take control of their own security, make informed decisions. It's like having a guidebook to navigate this complex world of cybersecurity.
It really is complex, isn't it? As we get deeper into this topic, it's striking how complicated the cybersecurity landscape really is, like a giant puzzle that's constantly changing.
It is a constantly shifting puzzle with so many pieces, and the stakes are incredibly high.
It's not just about the technology, right? It's about human behavior, psychology, even geopolitics. It's a fascinating field, one that affects every part of our lives.
It really is, and it's only going to become more important as we go forward.
Absolutely. And for anyone who's interested in learning more, there are so many resources out there, both online and offline. Blogs, podcasts, conferences, training courses. There's something for everyone.
It's important that we all make an effort to stay informed, whether we're tech experts or just everyday users.
Because in the digital age, cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. We can't just leave it to the experts.
Well said. This deep dive into CVE 2024-8069 has been really insightful, given us a lot to think about.
I agree. It's a good reminder that security is a journey, not a destination. And it's a journey we need to take together.
Speaking of journeys, we're not quite done yet.
That's right. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll be exploring some of the broader implications of this vulnerability and discussing what the future holds for cybersecurity.
Welcome back. We've been taking a deep dive into CVE 2024-8069, that Citrix vulnerability, and now it's time to kind of zoom out, look at the bigger picture. This vulnerability, it's really just one piece of a much larger puzzle, isn't it? It is, yeah. And it's a puzzle that keeps changing.
Constantly changing. So this vulnerability, it's a good example of a trend we see a lot in cybersecurity. Attackers are getting smarter. They're getting more persistent.
Absolutely. They're always finding these new ways to exploit things, targeting features you wouldn't even think about, components that might be overlooked.
It's like they're always searching for that weakest link, no matter how small.
Exactly.
So it's not enough to just patch this one thing, right? We have to be thinking about what's next, what's coming after that.
Right. It's a race in a lot of ways.
A race we can't afford to lose.
Exactly. The stakes are just too high. We're talking about protecting sensitive data, critical infrastructure, even national security.
This Citrix vulnerability, It shows how interconnected everything is in our digital world. One system goes down, it can have ripple effects everywhere.
Yeah, like dominoes. And that's why we need to move beyond just thinking about our own little piece of the puzzle. We need to work together, share information, really make a collective effort to stay ahead of these threats.
So what does the future of cybersecurity look like then? Are we always going to be playing catch up with these attackers? Or is there a way to get ahead of the curve?
Well, the challenges are definitely there, but I don't think we're destined to always be one step behind. There's a lot of innovation happening in cybersecurity. Things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, threat intelligence. These are powerful tools.
So we're not just building higher walls, we're getting smarter about how we approach security.
Right. We need to move from reacting to threats to actually predicting them, finding vulnerabilities before they're exploited, building systems that can bounce back from attacks.
And that probably means changing our mindset, not just the technology. We need everyone to be involved, from CEOs to everyday users. Create a culture of security.
I totally agree. Cybersecurity isn't just an IT problem anymore, it's everyone's responsibility.
Well said. As we wrap up our deep dive into CVE 2024-8069, I'm feeling a sense of urgency, but also optimism. The threats are real, but we have the ability to innovate and adapt.
Absolutely. If we work together, share what we know, and take a proactive approach, I think we can build a safer, more resilient digital world.
This has been an eye-opening conversation. Our listeners will definitely have a lot to think about. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Just this, don't get complacent. Stay informed, stay alert, and keep learning. The world of cybersecurity is always changing.
Great advice. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and to our listeners, stay safe out there.